Hello YouTube, this is Thomas1Edward2Henry3 here. I had fun doing my Great Race review. Sure, it was a hell lot of work and took way too long, but the end result was very rewarding. I thought to myself, what should I review next? I love doing reviews, though I'm not quite ready to do a review of every season, and I've reviewed all the specials. Then a thought occurred to me. Why don't I just talk about my favorite episodes? It's something I love doing, and am very passionate about, so it would be easy. And then, of course, I saw the Unlucky Tug's Top 10 Episodes video. And I thought, you know what? I'll do it. I was originally going to do a top 10 episodes, but there were just so many episodes I wanted to talk about that I decided to make this a two-part thing. Now, of course, these are all purely opinion. If you don't like an episode on this list, or think there's one that should be on the list, that's fine. But remember, this is top 10, 20 favorite episodes, not top 20 best as far as adaptation, story, and general fan consensus. And just to be safe, I'm gonna flip the videos to avoid copyright detection. I know it's probably fine, but I've already got a copyright strike on my channel, and with something this large, I just couldn't risk it. It's just such a big batch of episodes. But without further ado, here are my top 20 favorite Thomas the Tank Engine episodes. Part 1. Number 20. Come Out Henry and Henry to the Rescue, or The Sad Story of Henry and Edward, Gordon, and Henry. I put these two together because it's a two-parter. These were my dad's favorite stories as a child. He had a few Railway Series books, and this story always stood out to him. And I can see why. It's just a classic fun little tale. A train doesn't want to leave a tunnel, so rather than trying reasonable attempts to pull him out, the controller just bricks him up. It's hilarious. One thing I do like about this story is the moral. Henry only thinks about himself. He doesn't give a damn about the passengers who have to get to their destinations regardless of the weather, just his paintwork that can easily be fixed. Therefore, though a bit strange, the Fat Controller's punishment is completely justified. I guess one thing that made these two episodes special was how hard they were to find as a child. I would say they're the rarest episodes in the United States. They were only on the Thomas Gets Tricked VHS, which I only saw 2 or 3 times as a child, and that was only Ringo Starr's version. George Carlin's narration was never released on any VHS, and until about 6 years ago, the only Carlin version of Henry to the Rescue available was an extremely shitty quality one ripped from Shining Time Station. However, with YouTube and digital downloads, these two classic episodes can now be watched and relived whenever desired. Number 19. Double Teething Troubles. Bill and Ben, in my opinion, were Alec Baldwin's best character voices. They are just hilarious. They sound like Mickey Mouse's grumpy uncle or something. Double Teething Troubles was one of the show's funniest episodes just for that reason. These mischievous twins are always a treat, and here it's no exception. The beginning quarrel with them derailing is one of their best moments, actually. I don't know what it is, but the toothache quote has me in stitches every time.
Why does Percy want to wish us good luck? Because he knows we'll need it. A diesel with a toothache must be the worst diesel of all.
It's actually one of the funniest quotes from the show. Why is that? But I like how they're shown to be really hard-working too in this episode. They pull both the trucks and a broken diesel without any trouble. Derek is also an interesting character. He's actually one of the friendliest diesels in the show. It's a shame we never saw him again. No, calling all engines doesn't count. I don't know if it was just me, but I always thought his breakdowns were basically the equivalent of someone shitting themselves. I mean, the smoke's brown. Come on. Also, this is Boko's last appearance. Let's have a moment of silence for that. Number 18. A Better View for Gordon. This is Gordon at his best. A big, blue, arrogant, pompous ass. It's just so enjoyable to watch him like this. His rant about the boring wall is just classic. I don't really know how to explain it, but I find Grumpy Gordon very entertaining. But what's also funny is how his words bite him back not once, but twice. The crash is great too. If you didn't know, it's based off of a real crash in Paris in 1895. Remember the crash from Hugo? That's the exact one. This is also one of the rare times where we see the Fat Controller injured, and his comment to Gordon is priceless. I know most of you will disagree, but I love Alec Baldwin's Gordon voice. In Season 5, at least. Yes, he sounds extremely retarded, but I don't care. It just made the experience of watching this even better for me as a kid.
Help me, please.
Also, we all know James is a mega roaster.
The sky's empty. Like your smoke box, Percy.
That's all I can really say. Great crash, great character interaction. It's one of my favorite Gordon episodes. Number 17, Toad Stands By. There are many reasons why Oliver beats Duck, but the biggest is that Oliver is a complete badass. He gets shoved into a turntable by the trucks, and what does he do in return? He literally rips the leader apart. Yeah, Oliver's character development is just awesome. He goes from a little arrogant wimp to a thug who takes no shit. I love Scruffy too. I was lucky enough to get him in Wooden Railway, though I always got angry because I couldn't reenact him breaking. George Carlin got Scruffy's voice perfectly. He sounds like a 20s gangster, and he's just a lot of fun. Carlin also nailed the truck's song. Angelus did good too, but I found it odd how he was basically shouting the whole thing.
When the orders of suburbs, when the grates is falling, we just push them down the well.
Ah well, I always thought Carlin's Toad voice was annoying, so it levels out. But I like Toad's role too. This is the first time where he actually spoke, and Oliver couldn't have beat the trucks without him. This episode was epic for me as a child, and still is today. Oliver is the Great Western MVP. Number 16, Henry and the Elephant. This episode is interesting as it's the first story not to be adapted in the order it was written in the Railway series. It should have been after Thomas and Bertie, but wasn't made until 3 seasons later. And I never understood why. It's not a hard episode to adapt. But anyway, this is just such a fun story. An elephant gets loose and causes all sorts of problems. I don't know if it was the music or the way it was shot, but that scene where Henry goes through the tunnel was always so intense as a kid. Also, I absolutely love the sound effect they used for the workmen running out.
And they run out.
I always wondered if they just taped or glued the elephant to the trucks in that one shot. You know what I mean? But anyway, it's a fun episode with funny moments that always stuck with me as a child. Whenever I watched the Gallant Old Engine VHS, it was always my favorite.
Poor Henry.
Number 15, Toby and the Flood. This probably was the most difficult episode to film, and they pulled it off brilliantly. Toby and the Flood is an action-packed adventure that always got me in a hyped-up mood whilst watching my Races, Rescues, and Runaways VHS, in which it was the first episode. It's amazing how they managed to create the rivers and the dam explosion. It's pretty damn impressive. Also, I bet they used tomato soup in the water. The sets themselves look incredible too. They're so simple, yet the lighting and the sky backgrounds give it this dark, grim atmosphere. You know shit's about to happen. The music is incredible. The somber piece that plays at the beginning is one of my favorites from Mike and Jr. Now, this episode does have a few issues, like why did Toby just wait for the bridge to collapse and yeah, so forth, but everything else completely overshadows it, so I don't care. Toby and the Flood is an epic rescue story that never gets old for me. Number 14, Donald and Douglas, or Brake Van, and the Deputation. These are only 2 out of Season 2's legendary episodes. A lot of those came from my Thomas, Percy, and the Dragon VHS. Now that's an episode I really wanted to feature on this list too, but it just couldn't top the others. Donald and Douglas take nonsense from no one, and that's why they are 2 of my all-time favorite characters. When a brake van starts causing problems for them, they smash it to pieces. But despite that, they still try their hardest to show how useful both of them are. Everything that could go wrong basically goes wrong for the twins. Donald has an accident, they have to deal with an asshole brake van, and though not shown on TV, but they also misplace a coach, which causes all sorts of havoc. You'd think the Fat Controller would have had enough by then. But the one thing that isn't broken or smashed is Donald and Douglas's spirit and determination. And to add to that, the engines all band together to get a firm message across to the Fat Controller. I've always loved Percy's conversation with him.
Percy jumped. Yes, sir, please, sir.
If Bill and Ben were Alec Baldwin's best character voices, then by God, Donald and Douglas are by far George Carlin's best.
You're a muckle nuisance, said Donald. It's to leave you behind I be wanting.
Ringo does great too, but he just can't compete. George is having a ball with it. The fact that the most American foul-mouthed comedian can do such a great Scottish accent just goes to show how extremely talented George Carlin was. Regardless of narrator though, I love Donald and Douglas. Again, they're very high on my favorite characters list, almost at the top. Again, they stand no nonsense from no one. Honestly, their music theme is probably my favorite out of the 11 main engines. The Spiteful Brakeman was also nailed. He has, what, 2 lines, yet that's all he needs. The face does the rest. He looks like someone who's about to do some serious shit. Luckily, he gets completely wrecked. Oh yeah, I meant both types of wreck. I gotta stop doing that. Also, in that shot of his face being lifted by the crane, is he still alive or is he dead? If so, that means, holy crap, he's the first character to die on screen. Number 13, Rusty and the Boulder. Okay, I know exactly what half of you are thinking. Seriously? This Disneyland cash grab? Maybe it is, but they put major quality into it. This is a controversial episode. Fans either seem to love it or hate it. I'm obviously in the favorite category, but I can totally see why one wouldn't like this episode. This premise is a bit silly and definitely wouldn't have a place in Wilbur Awdry's books. And yeah, one could consider it the first episode made for merchandise. Neither the Boulder or Thumper appear or are mentioned again. And if you don't like this episode, that's totally fine. I fully understand why. But here's why I thought it worked. They put so much emotion and effort into it. They never officially acknowledge whether the boulder is alive or not. The audience are the only ones who see the face appears on the boulder, so that even leads to more mystery. And that's what's so great about this episode. Mystery. It just has such an eerie feel to it. The boulder is terrifying, even if there's no way a boulder would be that round in real life. The last lines from the narrator are some of the most goose-bumping inducing lines ever.
That its sighs are being carried on the wind to where it once used to stand proud and silent.
And so is the music, again from Toby and the Flood. And that last shot of the Fat Controller is chilling. It's like he sees something we don't. Now, about the action, well, it's pretty damn awesome. Again, I don't care if it's unrealistic, it always had me on the edge of my seat. Also, this is the first time we see an actual explosion in the shed. Holy crap! It always confuses me to this day what caused it. Was there dynamite in those sheds? I'll also add that this is the first episode on this list that was on a very special VHS called Spills and Chills. Now that was my shit. I still remember to this day watching it for the first time. I'd never seen anything like it before, and boy did it entertain me with the spooky and action-packed adventures that it had from Season 5. It was, and is to this day, my all-time favorite Thomas and Friends VHS or DVD. Number 12, Stepney Gets Lost. This is another episode from Spills and Chills, and I'll say this. Stepney Gets Lost is officially the darkest episode of Thomas and Friends. It has to be. Not the scariest, but definitely the darkest. An engine gets sent to a room where he will get dropped in a pool of sizzling metal and fire to be melted down. I don't know about you, but that's pretty much the equivalent of a gas chamber in a concentration camp. Okay, I admit I analyzed that a bit too far, but you get the idea. This was one episode that always stuck with me as a child. It wasn't necessarily my favorite back then, but I've really started to appreciate it more as I got older. The one thing that makes this episode so chilling is the sets. These sets are very simple, but the way they lit them made them terrifying. The bright red smelters is pretty much what hell would look like. And what makes this scene even more disturbing is the absence of music. I can't really explain why, but having no music makes the moment far more disturbing. I never thought the episode went too far, though. The claw's function's never revealed, and we don't actually see the molten metal, and of course, Stepney gets rescued in the end. But Britt and David went full out with this episode, and that's what I praise them for. Now, there are a few problems that I recognize, like why Ari and Bert were able to just scrap Stepney when he's already been rescued and restored. And honestly, I think this episode would have worked better with Oliver as the main character, because his struggle with Scrap is a more personal one. but those are minor issues. What worked well was perfect. Also, I gotta add that before they were tamed in the 6th season, Airy and Bert were the scariest characters in the whole show. Well, okay, maybe except for that truck, but you get the idea. Anyway, Stepney Gets Lost took many risks, and most of them hit bullseye for me. It's just as terrifying every time I watch it. Also, there's something so satisfying about the last line in the music.
Bluebells forever.
Number 11. Busy Going Backwards. Toad was never given any time to shine in the Railway series. Of course, Oliver wasn't either, but Toad's only major role was in Toad Stands By. So it's great that in the 5th season they gave both Toad and Oliver some major screen time. And Busy Going Backwards was a legendary episode. First of all, I think this is the first time that a rolling stock character got the main role. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's a neat achievement. But second, it is a complete runaway of humor and action-packed adventure. It is the best moment of the Troublesome Trucks in my opinion. It's just so epic, but wouldn't have been nearly as epic without the William Tell Overture. Good God, praise to you, Mike and Junior, brilliant choice. It's because of this episode that it's my favorite piece of classical music. This episode has some hilarious moments too. Toad smashing through the gates, Oliver's corny joke, the conductor leaping off the train. Seriously, look at his expression. Speaking of expressions, the part where they almost hit Gordon still has me in stitches today. I don't know why. The facial expressions are gold. He's like, "Holy shit!" And James's line, "Oh my God." The way Alec Baldwin voiced him in this episode has me dying every time.
Oh my goodness!
Yes, make your own conclusions, but I think James has a pretty obvious secret. We all know. Heck, even Conan O'Brien brought it up with Baldwin.
What was that? Exclaimed James.
Speaking of voices, Baldwin's voice for Toad was spot on. A posh little break band with a lot of dignity. It would have been interesting if Alec kept the voices had Toad and Oliver appeared in Season 6. But regardless, Baldwin's take on Toad just adds to how great this episode is. Yes, this episode is fantastic. So fantastic that I feel putting it 11th is a real insult, but it just couldn't top the next 10 episodes. But it's still a runaway adventure that will almost throw you off the rails with excitement. Number 10. Thomas and the Jet Engine, or Thomas the Jet Engine. Go watch the Unlucky Tug's top 10 list. He explains everything about this episode. But okay, I'll share my opinion. For me, Season 6 is my least favorite of the classic era. Some of the stories were a little clunky, and it was just so, well, ugly. The dull lighting, basic sets, and terribly painted engines made it lifeless. And of course, Alec Baldwin's completely toned-down narration didn't help.
Scary Jack Frost, cried James.
However, there were a few episodes I thoroughly enjoyed, like Harvey to the Rescue, Duncan, World's Strongest Episodes, the Pack episodes, and especially Thomas and the Jet Engine. Like Rusty to the Rescue, it completely ignores realism and logic, but unlike Rusty to the Rescue, which had a serious tone, this episode went full out for laughs. The Unlucky Tug said it's the funniest episode in the show, and I can only agree with him.
Hi, Gordon. Bye, Gordon. Want to race, Thomas? Beeped Bertie. Never mind.
And to be honest, the fact that it's unrealistic adds to how funny it is. It's just a bizarre and crazy situation. You're always thinking, what moron filled the jet engine with fuel? I remember the first time I watched this, my dad happened to be in the same room, and he was howling with laughter. That really shows something. Also, I don't usually praise the UK narrations simply because I don't usually watch them, but by God! Michael Angelis must have had so much fun with this episode. His energy is amazing.
The driver tried to put on the brakes, but Thomas couldn't stop. Thomas had never been so excited.
And again, the William Tell Overture only adds to the excitement. There's not much else I can really say that hasn't already been said. It's one hell of a ride, and always has me wanting more. Number 9. Edward's Exploit. This was another episode on the Thomas, Percy, and Dragon VHS, so I have a lot of memories with this one. Like Oliver, Donald, and Douglas, Edward was a real MVP. The other engines harass him about being old, but even with a broken crank pin, he still manages to get passengers home safely. It's a very simple and generic premise. We've seen it before in episodes like Coal and Troublesome Trucks. So what makes Edward exploits stand out? Well, one thing is that it's pretty much the climax of the anti-Edward sentiment we see in seasons 1 and 2. It started in Edward and Gordon and was in episodes like Trouble in the Shed, Cows, and especially Old Iron. Edward's exploit is where it concludes, in the Audrey base episodes, of course. Edward shows that he's still a very dedicated engine, so it's basically like the final kick in the butt to Henry, Gordon, and James, and that's awesome! And you know what's more awesome? How epic this story is. For starters, the music is amazing. I'd say the music is some of the best from the electronic synthy era of Thomas. There's just something so haunting about that theme when Edward first enters the storm. And can we talk about Edward's theme here? In Season 1, Edward's theme was nice, but nothing really outstanding. It was pretty generic. But here, holy crap! I don't know how they did it, but the way it builds up gets you pumped. No storm is gonna stop this blue badass. And that brings me to the second point, how they managed to create the stormy atmosphere. The way they lit the set is very chilling. You'll notice that the background is still blue sky, but to be honest, I didn't actually notice that until I watched this for the video. That just shows how incredible the lighting and atmosphere was. Both the music and atmosphere created an extremely epic story. When Edward's theme roars into action, you know he's not going down. He basically rolls into the station on one wheel, and despite being pretty late, the passengers are very proud of him. At the end of the episode, you feel such a satisfaction, like, yes! In your face! Not to mention the last line from the narrator.
Duck and Boko saw to it that Edward was left in peace. Gordon and James remained respectfully silent.
It was the final episode on Thomas Percy and the Dragon, and boy was it a phenomenal conclusion to an amazing batch of episodes. Number 8. Lady Hat's Birthday Party. This is the first episode to have a human character in a main role, which is nice. We really get to see more of the Fat Controller's character. And holy shit, this episode is exploding with laughs. The only episode that could top its humor is Thomas and the Jet Engine, but I put this further up on the list simply because of the character you see with the Fat Controller. You normally see him as the fat man controlling the engines, but he's also such a devoted husband that he will stop at nothing to get to his wife's birthday party. Damn, he deserves a lot of respect.
I'm afraid our fireman's taken ill. Then I'll be your fireman, sighed Sir Topham Hatt.
See what I mean? Lady Hat is also likable. This is her first major appearance. Yeah, you might not believe it, but she had no speaking roles in the Railway series. In fact, she wasn't even referred to by her name. Her husband shows up in the most filthy outfit ever, but she overlooks that because she knows he persevered through so much trouble to get to her party. We see Caroline and George again, which is great. And again, Baldwin gets another voice spot on. Caroline is very funny.
I'm hot! My engine will overheat!
Oh my goodness! Again, this whole episode is enormously funny. First of all, you gotta laugh at how concerned Sir Topham Hatt is about his suit getting dirty, considering it's only gonna get worse. Then you get bother.
Bother, 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 bother!
Nothing else I can really say about that. That catchphrase is priceless. And third, everything that could go wrong goes wrong. How many times do you get thrown in a muddy pond whilst on the way to your wife's birthday party? The way his model just tips out has me howling. And I don't really know why. It's just so funny. But anyway, this episode always had me cackling as a kid, and still does today. Number 7. Percy's Ghostly Trick, or Ghost Train. This is a common fan favorite, and rightfully so. It's the first spooky episode of the show, and boy did they get it nailed. This was the scariest episode before Season 5. The opening shots with the ghost engine are truly scary. And no, I'll just put it out there, I do not believe in that whole Timothy thing. It's an interesting story, and Kane Fan 701 did a great take on it, but there are so many reasons why that story is false. First of all, Timothy wasn't in the Railway series, of course. That model you see is just Percy's model with white streamers. But this leads me to the thing I most admire about this episode. The Railway series story wasn't necessarily scary. It was just Percy playing a joke on Thomas. There was no eerie fog and spooky atmosphere. If for TV the story was adapted exactly as it was, it would be interesting, but not very memorable. But with the spooky sets, eerie fog, and terrifying music, the crew made Ghost Train feel very, well, ghostly. We didn't need to see the ghost train at the beginning. We could have just started with Percy telling Thomas and Toby the story. Yet the crew brilliantly crafted an opening scene that still haunts me to this day. Hell, whenever I watched the Percy's Ghostly Trick VHS when I was a kid, after the Thomas anthem ended, I got so freaked out because I knew what was coming. Can I just say how spooky those trees are? Also, did they make completely new sets just for this episode, or was it all just heavily decorated? Throughout my whole life, I've wondered what Crow's Crossing would have looked like during the day. The scene where Percy spooks Thomas is very chilling. First of all, just look at Tidmouth. That's not Tidmouth, that's every kid's nightmare. I always thought the cranes looked like dinosaurs, something they brought up in A Bad Day at Castle Lock. Second, both George and Ringo do great ghostly voices. And third, the music is some of the most terrifying I've heard in my whole life. There is no way that the real sounding instruments from Season 3 onwards could have made this as spooky. The electronic synths make the theme utterly bone-chilling. You also gotta love Percy's character here. Thomas completely disses him at the beginning, but Percy completely scares him shitless. That deserves some respect, people. Also, I gotta ask, why isn't Thomas completely overwhelmed with grief after Toby tells him Percy, his best friend, basically died? Did he not believe him at first, but then when Percy came to the shed, he got traumatized? Even if that was the case, Thomas would still be in a massive state of mourning the next day, not just a little spooked. Shit, I've just found a plot hole! Oh well, maybe as soon as he left he realized it was Percy and was too embarrassed to come back to the shed. But that is a very minor issue. The episode is still legendary. It's one that I, and many others, still favor to this day. Number 6. The Diseasel. What can I say? I love Bill and Ben. They're so oblivious and innocent, but at the same time they can be little yellow devils when it comes to playing tricks. And nowhere is it more apparent than in their debut episode here. Also from Thomas, Percy, and the Dragon, it was a favorite of both me and my dad. He also had mainline engines as a kid, and like me, had very fond memories of Bill and Ben. Whenever I was mischievous, he would call me Bill and Ben, and then I'd joke, oh, maybe you're Boko, because we're causing so much trouble to you. Yeah, those were fun times. What I find especially hilarious is how bizarre Bill and Ben's plan is. Boko took their trucks, so for revenge, they try to drive them insane. I mean, how can you not laugh at that? It's also a very quotable episode.
It's a waddle, coughs and sneezels, spread diseasels.
The music only adds to how much I love it. Bill and Ben's theme, for starters, was one of those themes that always stuck with me. The bouncy electronic jives are so enjoyable to listen to. And the music when the Trins trick Boko is phenomenal too. As a kid, I would always whistle or hum it whilst playing with my wooden trains or doing whatever a kid does. To be honest, I also found this episode a little intense as a kid. I don't know why, but that shot where Boko's face was the whole frame always freaked me out. The music where Bill rolls alongside Boko is too, but it's all in a good way. You know shit's about to go down. Also, it's very clever how they first introduced Boko with the music and the moving shot that eventually reveals him. When you first meet him, he seems like a pretty mean guy. You wonder, is this another bully Diesel like, well, Diesel? But no, the episode has a nice twist that shows him to be a nice guy. There's just something so warm about Boko. He's so friendly he could be Santa Claus. It'd be nice to see him again in the future. Until the 5th season, The Diseasel was, in my opinion, the funniest Thomas episode. I just had so much fun watching it, and Bill and Ben are 2 of my favorite characters, along with Duke and Henry. And I'm so pleased that they brought them back for Season 17. On a side note, does anyone else find Boko's giddy face hilarious? Anyway, The Diseasel was a childhood favorite of mine, and still is to this day. Number 5. The Flying Kipper. I think it's pretty obvious that this was going to be on my list. Everyone loves it, and so do I. There's a reason Henry is my #1 favorite character. He had a lot of the great episodes, but the Flying Kipper is not a great episode. It's a fantastic episode. Now the story is actually quite simple. Henry pulls a train of fish and crashes. Aside from the crash maybe, what's so interesting about it? Well, much like Ghost Train, the crew took a fairly simple story and made it on such a grand scale. The Flying Kipper theme is an eargasm. They could have just used Henry's regular theme, but no. Much like Edward's theme in Season 2, they took a theme that was nice to listen to, but nothing special, and made it an epic masterpiece. Do I even need to talk about the sets? They took familiar locations and made them look like something out of a dreamland with the snow and lighting. Henry's silhouette against the dawn are some of the most beautiful shots of the entire show. And you'll notice, like Ghost Train, the atmosphere is nowhere else in the season, just in this episode. And to add to that, I didn't realize this until now, but it's the only Season 1 episode to feature that harbor. That really surprises me because it's an amazing set. And now let's talk about the crash. It's the best of the entire show, hands down. What made it so amazing was how intense it was. Until the 7th season, this was the only time where we saw an engine completely get knocked over on its side. Speaking of which, this was the first episode to feature an on-screen crash, period. And no, I never considered Thomas hitting the snow to be a real crash, because, well, he just gets stuck in snow and stays on the rails. And James's crash was off-screen. But the one thing that made this episode so special was the fact that I only saw it once or twice when I was very young. For some reason, I just couldn't come across it. That was strange because it was on 3 VHS's, so it wasn't a rare episode like The Sad Story of Henry. But until I began watching Thomas again on YouTube, I only had this extremely vague memory of Ringo Starr's version on tenders and turntables. And that leads me to another special thing about this episode. This episode is what brought me back into interest of Thomas the Tank Engine. It was a rainy day back in 2009. I had just eaten a piece of fried chicken for dinner, and then up in my room I took a peek in my complete Railway Series collection, as I often did from time to time. I came across the Flying Kipper from Henry the Green Engine, and that vague memory of the episode flashed in my head. Suddenly, it occurred to me, what if I can watch it on YouTube? I hardly ever used YouTube back then, but I went on, searched it up, and sure enough, the Flying Kipper was there. I will never forget how enchanted it was to finally see the story that I'd wanted to for years. It was almost like watching it for the first time. And from then on, I developed a hobby of secretly watching Thomas episodes on YouTube. Toby and the Stout Gentleman and Cole were on the same VHS and had the same situation, but I have no memories of watching those episodes as a kid. That just goes to show how amazing the Flying Kipper was to stick in my memory like that. Like I said before, it's a general fan favorite, and rightfully so. The Flying Kipper is a masterpiece of Thomas and Friends. Number 4. Escape. Yeah, another obvious one, but what can I say? I love it. So much, in fact, that I actually put this at number 2 at first, but I just couldn't put the other episodes lower. You'll notice this is the only 3rd season episode on this list. 3rd season was great, but it just didn't reach the level of the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th seasons. But again, it was still great, and Escape is the greatest of them all. It's by no doubt the most epic story from Thomas and Friends. Douglas and Oliver's escape is full of action. Like Stepney Gets Lost, it's quite dark. Of course, more is revealed in the Railway Series story, but I get why they simplified it here. I like how they added a new scene at the beginning with Trevor. Sure, it's random, but it really does establish Douglas's fear of Scrap, and we feel more of a connection when he discovers Oliver. This is another reason I like Oliver way better than Duck. His backstory is fascinating. Again, the episode doesn't go into detail like the Railway Series, but still manages to get it across. You know Oliver is in serious trouble just by the way he speaks. And unlike the Railway Series, Oliver is all rusty, which makes it way more haunting. You don't know how long he's been there, but regardless, he definitely looks like a prisoner who's been through some serious trauma. Think of it like that Afghan girl from that iconic photograph. The fact that we don't see his face until that moving shot makes it even more spooky, but his spirit is not rusted, and you gotta admire his courage. That's why his episodes in NWR Origins were my favorite to make. Douglas is also awesome. He was almost in the same situation as Oliver, so it's great to see him make a connection in a split second and decide to help Oliver. No other engine would probably do that. But Douglas knew the horrors of scrap, so he didn't think twice. Do I even need to go on about the music? The episode wouldn't be nearly as epic without it. Heck, I wonder if they ripped it from Indiana Jones. Does anyone else see similarities? But the one thing that made this episode really intense were the sets. The way they lit the sets made it truly terrifying. I recall reading on the wiki that the scrapyard was just a redressing of certain sets. And if that's the case, they did a damn good job because I don't recognize any of it. Rusty to the Rescue did the same thing, but you could kinda tell that it was Croven's Gate with a few buildings added. This episode is very intense. It just puts you in this mood of, come on, hurry! Can't think of many other episodes that do that. There's not much more I can say about this episode, other than it's, well, epic. It's basically the Great Escape and Schindler's List with trains. That's why it's a huge fan favorite, and I fully agree. It's dark, intense, and has you on the edge of your seat with excitement. Number 3. Duncan Gets Spooked. Now this is an episode I haven't seen many others call one of their favorites. It's not disliked, like Rusty and the Boulder, but I don't know many people who'd put this high on their list, except for maybe the spookiest episode. Correct me if I'm wrong. But for me, holy crap, do I love it. I loved it as a kid, and I still love it now. This is Season 5 at its best, taking a simple story and making it unforgettable. Whenever I crossed an iron bridge as a kid, I'd think of Duncan Gets Spooked. Whenever someone mentioned the word ravine, I'd think of Duncan Gets Spooked. Whenever someone mentioned ghost trains, I'd think of this ghost engine, not the one from the actual episode Ghost Train. The thing that makes this episode work so well is how haunting Rusty's ghost story is. Never really went into detail with Percy's ghost. It's frightening, don't get me wrong, but that's just more of the physical look. We don't really know anything about its backstory except for it had some sort of accident that involved plunging into a gap. Same thing applies to Scaredy engines. We only hear the end of Edward's story, not what actually happened to the engine. Here, not only do we get a full story, but we see it on screen. I am shocked that this was actually able to go in, considering we see an engine fall off a bridge and die right in front of us. We feel more of a connection, and had Rusty's story been true, we'd fully understand why Duncan would get, well, spooked. But the one thing that made this episode stick out to me, and I'm sure you'll all agree, is the music. This is one of the most haunting pieces of music in general that I have heard in my life. Notice how I said haunting, not spooky. Yeah, it's spooky, but it's also got a sad feeling to it. You really feel for that engine. It's tragic, even though it's made up. Unlike many pieces of music from the TV show, I always remembered the tune of this piece. It is without a doubt my favorite non-character theme from Thomas and Friends. The music combined with the spooky mist and eerie moon made for a terrifying scene. But not every praise to this episode is spooky related. The truck's crash at the beginning is pretty awesome. Yeah, there's no explanation how they derailed, but so what? It was great to see the trucks get what they deserved. Once again, whenever I was up on a high bridge in the hills or mountains, I'd think of this episode. Particularly this bridge in Big Sur. When I was a kid, my dad had these 2 raised planters in the garden. I cannot tell you how many times I'd grab a piece of wood, put it between the two, and reenact the episode with my wooden railway trains. I never had Duncan, so I'd always use Rheneas for him. It was just so exciting to see the trucks fall off a bridge into a muddy swamp below. And that feels silly. I guess I must be a destructive maniac. Story-wise, it may not be the best, but it's good. It's a typical Ghost Train story, but with the other aspects like music and Rusty's ghost story, you don't care. This is more of a nostalgic one for me. I love me some spooky thrillers, and this is definitely one of the best. It's a childhood favorite that carries on to this day. Also, like Rusty and the Boulder, that last line from the narrator plus the fade of Duncan's face is very haunting.
He did, though, when he thought his driver wasn't looking, just to make sure that he was still there.
Number 2, Grandpuff and Sleeping Beauty. Again, put together because it's a two-parter. Had I made this list when I was a kid, this would not have been near the top. It'd still be on the list, don't get me wrong, but I gained such an appreciation and admiration for this episode as I got older. I seriously considered putting this number 1, but I just couldn't deprive the next episode of that rank. These were the first 2 episodes to feature the narrow gauge engines, and kicked off what many fans consider to be the best season of Thomas and Friends. I personally thought Season 5 was better, but Season 4 was definitely my second favorite. Grandpuff is a phenomenal episode, but why do I think that? Well, let's take a look. Grandpuff is very pretty, that's for sure, and Sleeping Beauty's a bittersweet conclusion, but the main aspect that hooks me is the characters and their relationship. Duke is my second favorite character from the show, behind Henry of course. He stands no nonsense, and when the other 2 tease him, he finds a sneaky way to get back at them. You may be an old Weezer, but you do not mess with this guy. But at the same time, if the others are in trouble, like Sir Handel and Bulldog, Duke will not yield until he has rescued him. He definitely is a bulldog. But this also means that despite their occasional quarrels, Duke deeply cares for Peter, Sam, and Sir Handel. Duke is the father figure, whilst Peter, Sam, and Sir Handel are his children. Sure, they can be rude to him, but Duke knows that they're only learning. Yes, he tells a story of Smudger, but he was probably only doing that for shock value. Peter, Sam, and Sir Handel may think he's an old grumpy ass at times, but they deeply care for their old Grandpuff. They'll do anything to help find him a new home. This leads to my next point. How optimistic they all are. It's a very painful situation they're in, and yet they all try their best to stay cheerful. These 2 engines are extremely worried about the fate of their friend, yet still try to keep up their cheeky manner. Duke, of course, isn't bought and is put in a shed. This scene is probably the saddest moment from Thomas the Tank Engine. The tear-jerking music combined with Duke's shed being buried creates such a depressing scene. Yet despite all that, what's the first thing that Duke says?
Oh well, he sighed. I'll go to sleep.
Holy
It'll help
crap!
pass.
This guy's optimism and hope is astounding! Duke must be in complete despair and emotional pain, yet still has hope. And that tiny bit of hope pays off when he's discovered. His discovery is actually very funny. First of all, the dude just falls right through the ground. Second, Duke's been discovered after 20 years of rotting in a shed. His first question is whether the man is a vandal. And if that's not enough, when Peter, Sam, and Sir Handel come to greet him after 20 years, he complains about being woken up, and the others still tease him about keeping them in order. It's like nothing ever happened. The relationship continues despite them being apart for over 2 decades. The last shot shows it all. I always thought Duke was about to cry. I just have so much respect for this character. His optimism and courage are on a massive level. He's the one character I want the most to return to the show because he has so much potential. My only guess as to why he never appeared again is that his model had to be repainted into Bertram at the last minute, and when they made the large-scale models, they couldn't afford to do them all, so they left out Duke and Sir Handel. And of course, Hit bought the show afterwards, and we know the direction they went. But I have hope that he'll return someday. They've brought back some other old characters, so I'm crossing my fingers, because Duke is a fantastic character. And my #1 favorite episode of Thomas the Tank Engine is Haunted Henry. Yeah, you may have seen this coming based off of that atrocious 2-part adaptation I did a few years back. I'm interested to see how many other people like this episode, because it's one that's not talked about a lot, except for how spooky it is, of course. I remember the very day I first watched this when I got spills and chills, and I was terrified of this episode. But after watching it again, it instantly became my favorite. It was my all-time favorite episode as a child, and still is to this day. I love Haunted Henry, and that's why I put it #1. The impact it had on me was way larger than any other episodes from the show. Remember how Stepney Gets Lost was the darkest episode? Well, this is the scariest, hands down. The music, the sets, the atmosphere, the story, Alec Baldwin's narration, that truck that looks like it had a brain fart. This is why Season 5 was my favorite season. They took simple stories and made them extremely entertaining. It didn't cower down at all. It went full force with spookiness or action, and Haunted Henry is a prime example of that. A simple ghost story turned into a horror film. The sets are hands down the scariest the crew has ever made. The way the fog wisps through those disturbing looking trees is more than a scary sight. Everyone often complains about Henry being a wimp in the new episodes, and I agree. But here, he has 100% justification. The music when Henry first puffs through the fog is traumatizing. Even today, when someone uses it in their videos, I literally shudder. What's even more frightening are the cowbells in the background that I didn't notice until I heard an instrumental for the first time. Holy shit, this is creepy! The episode had such an impact on me. Whenever someone used a fog machine at a party or whatever, I think of Haunted Henry. Whenever I hear owls hooting, I think of Haunted Henry. Whenever I came across dead trees, I think of Haunted Henry. Every Halloween, I think of some aspect of Haunted Henry. This is the definition of spooky. It's like if there was a guide to spookiness, it would be Haunted Henry. It's a terrifying episode, but nothing in this episode, not even the music, is more terrifying than
Ghosts!
For me, that was the scariest moment of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. Yeah, it does sound weird, but that face combined with Alec Baldwin's line was so frightening that it would be in my nightmares. That face gave me PTSD. And this is why Alec Baldwin is my favorite narrator. He wasn't soft like George Carlin. If the lines needed to be scary, he made them scary. Carlin technically may be the better narrator, but he could not pull that off. Michael Angelis almost does, but it feels kind of forced. There's just something about Baldwin that made the Season 5 episodes work. As far as the episode's story, it's pretty good. You don't know why someone is doing all these strange things. And then there's this nice twist when you think they've found out what the person was warning them about, but it's something completely different. And once again, Baldwin does brilliantly with Old Bailey. I bet you they modeled him off of George Carlin. The crash is great too. It's just so unexpected. And hell, a face almost falls off a truck. I'm really interested to see what Gordon's deleted scene was about. Was he teasing Henry about being scared and then later rolled by really fast to give him a spook? I'm intrigued. The scene with him that did make the final cut was really scary. The way he just suddenly zips by so fast almost made me jump when I first watched it. This episode got me thinking. As hard as the CGI series tries to replicate the spooky atmosphere, it just can't come close. There's something about models and a fog machine that makes it way more chilling. There would be no other episodes like this after the 5th season. They could come close, don't get me wrong. Jack Frost and A Bad Day at Castle Lock were pretty spooky too, but they're really mild compared to this episode, Duncan Gets Spooked, Toby's Discovery, and Ghost Train. I never got tired of watching Haunted Henry. It still spooks me to this day, and not many other stories do that. If you're not a fan of spooky stuff, that's fine, but for me, those were always the best stories because the models and sets could create really bone-chilling results. I've forgotten many episodes like Better Late Than Never, Thomas Gets Bumped, etc., but Haunted Henry and the majority of Season 5 were always a big solid brick in my memory. And remember, I was into Thomas before Season 5 existed, so it's not just a nostalgia thing. And that's why it has been my favorite episode of Thomas the Tank Engine. It's extremely spooky, yet exciting, and that's what I always was hyped about when watching the show.